The telegram arrived on the same day. Grace Nolan buried the last of her dreams in the sun-scorched earth behind her boarding house. And when she read the words through tear-blurred eyes, she realized that some deaths didn't require a body or a grave. Bentonville, Arkansas, in the summer of 1882, was a town that didn't forgive weakness, and Grace had learned to hide hers behind the stern set of her jaw and the efficient way she managed the boarding house her parents had left her. At 23 years old, she'd already lived through more loss than most women twice her age. Her parents had succumbed to scarlet fever 3 years prior. Her younger brother had been killed in a mining accident in Colorado. And now this telegram informed her that James Whitfield, the man she'd been engaged to for 2 years, had married a banker's daughter in St. Louis. The wedding had taken place a month ago. He hadn't even had the decency to tell her himself. She stood in the small garden plot where she'd been planting herbs, the paper crumpling in her fist. All those nights she'd spent planning their future, imagining the children they'd have, the ranch they'd build together with James's savings and her property. She'd turned down 3 other proposals waiting for him to make his fortune in Missouri. He'd promised he'd send for her as soon as he had enough money for them to start fresh. Instead, he'd found someone whose father could give him that fresh start without the wait. Grace walked back into the boarding house, past the parlor where 2 of her lodgers were playing chess, and climbed the stairs to her small private room. She sat on the bed her mother had made, in the house her father had built, and felt the weight of her future press down on her chest. This was it then. She would grow old in this boarding house, cooking meals for miners and merchants, washing their sheets, listening to their stories about wives and children waiting elsewhere. She would become one of those dried-up spinsters that people whispered about, the ones who'd been left behind. The tears came then, hot and bitter, for the children she'd never have, for the love that had turned out to be as substantial as smoke, for the dream of partnership and purpose that had kept her going through 3 years of loneliness. She cried until her head ached and her eyes were swollen, and then she washed her face in the basin and went downstairs to start supper because the lodgers needed to eat regardless of her shattered heart. She was peeling potatoes when she heard the knock at the front door. It was past the usual hour for new arrivals, nearly 6 o'clock, and Grace considered ignoring it. But business was business, and she couldn't afford to turn away paying customers. She dried her hands on her apron and opened the door. The man standing on her porch was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He held his hat in his hands, and dust covered his clothes from his boots to his broad shoulders. A horse stood tied at her gate, a handsome bay gelding that looked as tired as its rider. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice rough as gravel but somehow gentle at the same time. "I'm looking for a room if you have one available. Name's Austin Fairfield." Grace studied him with the practiced eye of a woman who'd been housing strangers for 3 years. He had an honest face, she decided, with the kind of sun lines around his eyes that came from working outdoors, and the calloused hands of a man who knew hard labor. He didn't have the shifty look of a gambler or the red-rimmed eyes of a drunk. "I have one room left," she said. 25 cents a night includes breakfast and supper. No drinking, no fighting, no women in the rooms." "Yes, madam, that sounds just fine." She stepped aside to let him in, and he moved past her with the careful grace of someone used to being in small spaces. He smelled like leather and horse and the open prairie, and something about his presence made her small entryway feel even smaller. "Payment in advance," she said, keeping her voice brisk and professional. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coins, counting them into her palm. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and she noticed they were scarred and weathered but clean. She showed him to the last available room on the second floor, a small space with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street of Bentonville. "Supper's in 20 minutes," she told him. "Dining room's at the back of the house." "Obliged," he said, and she left him there, closing the door behind her. When she returned to her kitchen, she found her hands were shaking slightly as she went back to peeling potatoes. She blamed it on the day's upheaval, on James's betrayal and her crying fit, not on the quiet stranger with the Summer Creek eyes. She had no room in her heart for anything but grief right now, and certainly no room for foolish notions about cowboys passing through town. Supper was the same as always. Her 6 lodgers gathered around the long table in the dining room, talking about the heat and the prospects for the fall harvest, about the new railway line being planned, and whether it would come through Bentonville or bypass them for Rogers. Grace served roasted chicken and potatoes, green beans from her garden, fresh bread with butter. She kept her eyes down and her hands busy, speaking only when spoken to. Austin Fairfield sat at the far end of the table, mostly quiet, answering questions when the other men asked but not volunteering much. She learned that he was a ranch hand, traveling from Texas up to Kansas to deliver a letter to a family whose son had died. He'd stopped in Bentonville to rest his horse and himself before the final leg of the journey. "That's mighty noble of you," said Thomas Parker, a merchant who'd been lodging with Grace for 6 months. "Most men wouldn't go out of their way like that." Austin's jaw tightened slightly. "Promised him I would. Man ought to keep his promises." Something in the way he said it made Grace's throat close up. She excused herself and retreated to the kitchen, busying herself with washing dishes until the men had finished their meal and dispersed to their rooms or the parlor. When she finally emerged to clear the table, she found Austin still sitting there, the only one left. "Can I help you with those dishes, madam?" he asked. Grace blinked, surprised. "That's not necessary." "Didn't ask if it was necessary. Asked if I could help." She should have said no. She should have maintained the proper distance between proprietor and lodger. Instead, she found herself nodding, and he followed her into the kitchen with a stack of plates balanced expertly in his large hands. They worked in silence for a while, Grace washing while Austin dried with a dish towel that looked absurdly small in his grip. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the evening light slanting through the window turned everything golden and soft. It should have been awkward, this stranger in her private space, but somehow it wasn't. "You've been crying," he said suddenly, his voice quiet, Grace's hands stilled in the dishwater. "That's not your concern." "No, madam, it's not, but I recognize that look. Whatever's hurting you, I'm sorry for it." She wanted to tell him to mind his own business, to take his presumption and his perceptiveness and leave her alone. Instead, she found herself saying, "I received some bad news today, about someone I thought I knew." Austin nodded slowly, drying a plate with careful attention. "Betrayal's worse than most kinds of pain, leaves a particular kind of wound. You sound like you speak from experience." "Had a wife once," he said, his voice even but his hands gripping the dish towel tighter. "Found her with my best friend in our bed. That was 5 years ago up in Colorado. Haven't seen either of them since." Grace turned to look at him properly, seeing the old pain in his eyes that mirrored her own fresh hurt. "I'm sorry. Long time passed." He set the plate down and picked up another. "But I remember what that first day feels like, when you realize everything you thought was real was just a story you were telling yourself. So if you need to cry in your kitchen where nobody can see, I won't judge you for it." Something about his matter-of-fact kindness broke through the careful control she'd been maintaining all evening. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she turned back to the dishes, blinking furiously. He was supposed to marry me. We'd been engaged for 2 years while he went to make his fortune. He married someone else instead, someone whose father could give him what he wanted faster. Then he's a fool, Austin said simply. Any man who'd give you up for money doesn't deserve you in the first place. You don't even know me. I know you keep a clean house and cook a fine meal. I know you work hard and you're kind to strangers. I know you've got sad eyes and strong hands and you're the type who keeps going even when your heart's breaking. That's more than enough to know you're worth 100 men with money. Grace let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. You have a silver tongue for a cowboy. Just telling the truth as I see it. He finished drying the last dish and hung the towel to dry. I'll bid you good night, Miss Nolan. Thank you for the meal and the kindness. He left before she could respond, and Grace stood alone in her kitchen feeling like something had shifted in the foundation of her world. Some small crack in the wall of her grief, letting in a sliver of light. The next morning, she woke before dawn as always and started breakfast preparations. She made biscuits and gravy, fried eggs and bacon, and strong coffee that could wake the dead. The lodgers came down in ones and twos, sleepy-eyed and hungry, and she fed them with her usual efficiency. Austin was the last to arrive, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt that was faded but mended carefully at the cuffs. "Morning," he said, taking the seat he'd occupied the night before. "Good morning," she replied, setting a plate before him. "Did you sleep well?" "Best I've slept in a week. That's a good bed you provide." She felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. "How long will you be staying in Bentonville?" "Planned to leave this morning, but my horse threw a shoe yesterday evening. Blacksmith can't see him until tomorrow." "If you have the room, I'd like to stay another night." "The room is yours," she said quickly, then felt her cheeks warm at her own eagerness. "I mean, yes, that would be acceptable." Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Obliged, madam." After breakfast, the lodgers dispersed to their various occupations, and Grace began the day's work. There were beds to change, floors to sweep, a chicken to butcher for supper. She threw herself into the tasks with determination, trying not to think about Austin Fairfield, or the way his quiet presence had somehow eased the sharp edges of her grief. She was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard footsteps behind her. Austin approached with his hat shading his eyes from the morning sun. "Wondered if you might need some help with anything," he said. "Seems wrong to sit idle when you're working so hard. You're a paying guest. You don't need to work." "Didn't say I needed to." "Said I wondered if you'd like the help." Grace sat back on her heels studying him. "Why?" "Because I've got time and ability, and you could use both from what I can see. That fence there is leaning, and the roof on your chicken coop is missing shingles. Your wood pile is low for the winter months coming. I'm handy with repairs, and I'd rather be useful than idle." She should have refused, should have maintained her independence, proved she didn't need anyone's help. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of doing everything alone, tired of being strong, tired of pretending that managing a boarding house by herself wasn't slowly wearing her down to nothing. "The fence has been bothering me," she admitted. "I've been meaning to fix it, but there's always something else that needs doing first." "Then let me handle it. You've got enough on your hands." He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and Grace found herself watching him from the kitchen window more than she should have. He moved with the confident economy of a man who knew his way around tools and timber, and he worked steadily without complaint, despite the heat. Around noon, she brought him a jar of cold water from the well and a plate of bread and cheese. "You're going to exhaust yourself," she said, noting the sweat on his brow and the way his shirt clung to his back. "I'm used to hard work in hot weather." He accepted the water gratefully and drank half of it in one long swallow. "This is nothing compared to branding season." "Tell me about it," she said, surprising herself. "About ranch work, I mean. I've lived in Bentonville my whole life, never been further than Fayetteville." So he told her, sitting in the shade of the oak tree while he ate, about the vast stretches of Texas grassland and the cattle drives that could last months. He described sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled sugar, about the camaraderie of cowboys and the hard, dangerous work of managing thousands of animals across hundreds of miles. He talked about the satisfaction of honest labor and the peace of the open range, and Grace listened like a child hearing fairy tales. "Sounds lonely," she said when he paused. "Sometimes it is," he admitted. "But it's a clean kind of lonely, if that makes sense. Just you and the land and the work. No complications, no betrayals. You know what's expected and you do it. No dreams," she asked softly. "No plans for something more." His eyes met hers, and something in their depths made her breath catch. "Had dreams once. House of my own, family, roots somewhere. Then life taught me that dreams have a way of turning to dust. Seemed safer to keep moving, stay unattached. That sounds like a lonely way to live." "Maybe," he said, "but at least it doesn't hurt when you move on." Grace wanted to tell him that was no way to live, that avoiding pain meant avoiding joy too, but who was she to talk? She'd been planning to do exactly the same thing, to wall herself off behind her boarding house and her routines, to never risk her heart again. "The fence is looking good," she said instead, changing the subject. "Should be done by evening. I'll start on the chicken coop tomorrow morning if that's all right with you." "Austin, you don't have to do all this." "Want to," he said simply, and there was something in his voice that made her heart skip unevenly in her chest. That evening at supper, Thomas Parker noticed the repaired fence and commented on it. "Fine work," he said. "Did you hire someone, Miss Nolan?" "Mr. Fairfield was kind enough to help," Grace said, feeling her cheeks warm. The other lodgers looked at Austin with a mixture of surprise and approval, and he shrugged uncomfortably. Seemed like it needed doing. After the meal, Grace found Austin in the kitchen again, ready to help with dishes. It was becoming a routine, this quiet companionship in the golden evening light, and she realized she'd begun to look forward to it. "You keep helping me like this, and I'll have to reduce your bill," she said, handing him a wet plate. "Don't want your money," he said. "Just want the company, if I'm being honest. The company of a heartbroken spinster running a boarding house. The company of a strong, capable woman who's had a hard blow and is still standing. That takes courage." Grace swallowed hard against the sudden lump in her throat. "I don't feel very courageous. Never does from the inside. But I've seen men break over less than what you've been carrying. You're still here, still working, still taking care of people. That's courage, even if it doesn't feel like it." She set down the dish she'd been washing and turned to face him fully. "Why are you being so kind to me? You're just passing through. You'll be gone in a day or two." Austin was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the dish towel. "Maybe that's exactly why. Because I am just passing through, and maybe I can give you something to remember that's better than what that fool in St. Louis left you with. Maybe I can remind you that not all men are liars and cowards. And maybe, if I'm being completely honest, it's because looking at you reminds me that I'm not as dead inside as I thought I was." The air between them felt charged, heavy with words unsaid and possibilities unexplored. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. This was dangerous territory, letting herself feel anything for a man who'd be gone in days, who lived a wandering life with no room for permanence. "I should finish the dishes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, madam," he said, But he didn't move away, and neither did she. The moment stretched between them like pulled honey, sweet and slow, until finally Austin took a step back and the spell broke. They finished the dishes in charged silence, and when Austin bid her good night, his hand brushed hers deliberately, a touch that felt like a question. Grace lay awake long into the night, staring at her ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to her. 2 days ago, she'd been mourning the death of her future with James. Now here she was, her skin tingling from the brush of a stranger's hand, her mind full of a cowboy with sad eyes and gentle words. It was madness. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of foolishness that had led her to waste 2 years waiting for a man who didn't deserve her waiting. But it felt different with Austin. James had made her feel like she needed to be patient, to wait, to prove herself worthy of his eventual attention. Austin made her feel seen, valued, worthy right now as she was. James had talked about their future in vague, someday terms. Austin spoke to her in the present, about real things, honest things. She told herself it didn't matter, that he was leaving, that this was just a moment of kindness in her grief and nothing more. But her treacherous heart didn't believe her, and when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of Summer Creek eyes and hands that knew how to build things instead of tearing them down. The next day dawned clear and hot, the kind of Arkansas summer day that made breathing feel like work. Grace woke with her heart doing a strange, fluttery dance, and she told herself firmly that it had nothing to do with the cowboy sleeping down the hall. She went through her morning routine with determined efficiency, making breakfast and serving it to the lodgers with her usual competence. Austin appeared at the table looking tired, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as she had. Their eyes met across the dining room, and something passed between them that made Grace's hands shake slightly as she poured coffee. After breakfast, he headed out to repair the chicken coop as promised, and Grace forced herself to focus on her work. She had sheets to wash, and the physical labor of hauling water and scrubbing fabric was exactly what she needed to clear her head. But she found herself glancing out the window repeatedly, watching the way Austin moved, the strength in his shoulders, the careful attention he paid to every detail of the work. Around mid-morning, a well-dressed stranger arrived at the boarding house asking for lodging. Grace showed him the room Austin would be vacating and quoted her usual rate. The man looked around with a critical eye that made her defensive. "It's clean and comfortable," she said, lifting her chin. "And the meals are good." "I can see that," the man said, his tone making it clear he could also see plenty that he found wanting. "I suppose it will do for a few nights. I'm Harold Chen, a traveling salesman. I'll be in town for the week." Grace took his payment and left him to settle in, feeling obscurely insulted by his condescension. She returned to her laundry with more vigor than necessary, scrubbing sheets until her knuckles were red and her back ached. "You're going to scrub holes in those if you're not careful." Austin's voice came from behind her and she jumped. "You startled me. Sorry, came to get some water. Finished with the chicken coop. It should hold up fine through the winter now." Grace straightened, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "You've done so much. I don't know how to thank you. Could start by taking a break. You've been working since dawn and it's near noon now. Heat like this, you need to rest some." "I don't have time to rest. There's too much to do." Austin frowned, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "You're pushing yourself too hard, trying to stay so busy you don't have to think." Grace felt her defenses rise. "And what if I am? What business is it of yours?" "None," he admitted. "But I hate seeing you wear yourself down to nothing trying to outrun your feelings. Believe me, I've tried it. Doesn't work." "Then what does work?" she demanded, surprising herself with the raw need in her voice. Tell me, because I don't know. I don't know how to stop feeling like my whole future just died, like everything I planned and hoped for was just a stupid girl's fantasy. I don't know how to look ahead and see anything but more of the same, years and years of this, until I'm old and bitter and alone. So if you know the secret, please share it, because I'm drowning here." The words came out in a rush, and she was horrified to realize she was crying again, tears streaming down her face as all the grief and fear she'd been trying to hold back broke through. She turned away, ashamed, but Austin stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. He held her while she sobbed against his chest, one hand stroking her hair, the other steady against her back. He smelled like sawdust and sunshine, and his heartbeat was strong and even beneath her ear. He didn't tell her to stop crying or that everything would be fine. He just held her and let her break apart in the safety of his arms. When the storm finally passed, Grace pulled back, mortified. "I'm sorry. I've gotten your shirt all wet. Don't care about the shirt." His hands cupped her face gently, his thumbs wiping away the tears on her cheeks. "Grace, listen to me. That future you lost, it wasn't real. It was built on a liar's promises. You're not grieving something real. You're grieving the hope of it, and I know that hurts just as much. But the future isn't dead. It's just different than you thought it would be." "What future?" she whispered. "What is there to look forward to?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know it's something. Maybe it's building this boarding house into the finest establishment in Northwest Arkansas. Maybe it's traveling, seeing those places you've never been. Maybe it's finding love with someone who deserves you, who'll choose you every single day. Or maybe it's something you haven't even imagined yet. But it's there, Grace. You just have to be willing to look for it." "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared to hope for anything again." "I know. I've been scared too for 5 years now. But meeting you these past couple days, it's reminded me that being scared isn't the same as being dead, and living scared isn't really living at all." His hands were still cradling her face, and his eyes were searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, and Grace realized with a start that she wanted him to kiss her. Wanted it with a fierce, sudden need that had nothing to do with James or grief and everything to do with this man in front of her, this unexpected gift of kindness and understanding. But Austin stepped back, his hands falling away, and the moment passed. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough. "I'll finish the laundry if you tell me how you want it done." Grace wanted to protest, but the truth was she was exhausted, wrung out emotionally and physically. So she nodded and showed him the process, then retreated to her room and lay down on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She must have fallen asleep, because when she woke, the light had shifted and the heat of the day had peaked. She rose and splashed water on her face, then headed downstairs to find the laundry hung neatly on the line and Austin nowhere in sight. The lodgers were starting to gather for supper, and she needed to cook. She threw herself into preparing the meal, making roasted pork with apples, potatoes, biscuits, and green beans. Harold Chen, the new lodger, came down and immediately began complaining about the heat in his room and the noise from the street. Grace gritted her teeth and promised to see what could be done, though privately she thought he was just a disagreeable sort who'd find fault with anything. Austin came in last, his hair damp from washing, and took his usual seat. His eyes found hers across the room, and the look he gave her was so warm, so full of concern and something else she was afraid to name, that she had to look away before she did something foolish like cry again. Supper was its usual organized chaos, men talking over each other about politics and business and the price of cotton. Harold Chen dominated the conversation, pontificating about his travels and his success in a way that made Grace's teeth ache. She noticed Austin's jaw tightening as Chen went on, especially when the man made a dismissive comment about women running businesses they don't understand. "Miss Nolan seems to understand her business just fine," Austin said, his voice mild but his eyes hard. "House is clean, food is excellent, and she manages everything efficiently. Seems like understanding to me." Chen sniffed. "I'm sure she does her best. I'm simply saying that a woman alone without a husband to guide her is at a natural disadvantage." "Only disadvantage I see is having to listen to men who think their opinions are worth more than they are," Austin said, and Grace had to hide her smile behind her napkin. Chen looked affronted, and the other lodgers shifted uncomfortably. Thomas Parker cleared his throat. "I think we can all agree that Miss Nolan runs an excellent establishment, best boarding house in Bentonville, without question." The conversation moved on, but Grace felt a warm glow in her chest. Austin had defended her, stood up for her, in a way that James never had. James had always been quick to agree with men like Chen, to suggest that Grace would benefit from male guidance and oversight. Austin simply saw her competence and refused to let anyone diminish it. After supper, she wasn't surprised when Austin appeared in the kitchen to help with dishes. It felt natural now, this routine they'd fallen into, and Grace realized she was going to miss it terribly when he left. "Thank you," she said as they worked, "for what you said at supper. Just the truth." "That Chen fellow is an ass," Grace laughed, surprised. "He is, isn't he? But his money's good, so I'll tolerate his opinions." "That's gracious of you. I wanted to throw my water in his face." "I appreciate your restraint." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Austin said, "I talked to the blacksmith today. My horse will be ready tomorrow morning. I'll be leaving after breakfast." Grace's hands stilled in the dishwater. She'd known this was coming, had known from the start that he was just passing through, but hearing it stated so baldly made her chest ache. "Of course. You have a promise to keep, Grace." He set down his dish towel and turned to face her. "These past few days, they've meant something to me. More than I expected. More than I probably should let them mean, given that I'm just a drifting cowboy with nothing to offer." "You've offered me kindness when I needed it most," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "That's not nothing. It's not enough, though. You deserve someone who can stay, who can build a life with you. You deserve stability and security and all those things I can't give." "Did I ask you for those things?" "No, but you should. You should ask for everything, Grace. You should demand the world from whoever loves you because you're worth it." She turned fully to face him, her heart pounding. "And what if I told you that what I want is right in front of me? What if I told you that these past few days have shown me that maybe the future I thought I wanted wasn't the right one anyway? Maybe I was trying to fit myself into someone else's dream instead of finding my own?" Austin's expression was torn, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "I'm leaving tomorrow. I have to deliver this letter, finish what I promised." "I know. I'm not asking you to break your word. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe your journey doesn't have to end in Kansas. Maybe it could circle back to Arkansas, to Bentonville, to me, Grace." Her name came out rough, almost broken. "I don't have anything. No ranch, no home, just what I can carry on my horse and what I can earn with my hands. That's not enough for a life. It's a start, though, and I have this house, this business. Maybe together we'd have enough." "You're asking me to stay." "I'm asking you to consider it, to think about it while you're traveling to Kansas and back, to ask yourself if maybe you're tired of running from the possibility of being hurt again. Because I am, Austin. I'm tired of being afraid. These past days with you have taught me that." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. "You're the bravest woman I've ever met." "Then be brave with me," she whispered. "Take the risk." He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted like hope and fear and new beginnings. His lips were gentle but sure, and Grace felt something in her chest crack open, letting in light she'd thought she'd never see again. She kissed him back with everything in her, all her grief and loneliness and desperate hope pouring into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Austin rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face like she was something precious. "I'll come back," he said. "I don't know when exactly. It might be a month, maybe 6 weeks, depending on the weather and the roads. But I'll come back, Grace. I'll finish what I promised, and then I'll come back to you, if you'll have me." "I'll wait," she said. "But Austin, if you decide during your travels that this isn't what you want, that you're not ready to stop moving, I'll understand. I won't hold you to anything." "I'm already held," he said. "You've got my heart whether you want it or not." They kissed again, slower this time, sweeter, and Grace let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, her future wasn't dead after all. Maybe it was just beginning, in the arms of a cowboy who'd wandered into her life at exactly the right moment. They finished the dishes together, hands brushing, stealing kisses when the mood struck, and Grace felt lighter than she had in years. When Austin finally went upstairs to his room, she stood in her kitchen and pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. She barely slept that night, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. What if he didn't come back? What if he changed his mind? What if this was just a beautiful moment that would fade into memory and nothing more? But every time the fear rose, she pushed it back down. She'd meant what she said about being brave, about being tired of living scared. If Austin came back, they'd figure it out together. If he didn't, at least she'd tried. At least she'd taken the risk. Morning came too soon. Grace rose in the dark and made breakfast with extra care, wanting Austin's last meal at her table to be special. She made his favorites from the few meals they'd shared. Biscuits with honey, bacon, eggs cooked the way he liked them. The other lodgers came down and ate with their usual appetites, oblivious to the ache in Grace's chest. Austin was the last to appear, his saddlebags over his shoulder, his expression somber. He sat and ate quietly while Grace busied herself in the kitchen, not trusting herself to watch him. When the meal was over and the other lodgers had dispersed, he came to find her. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "Safe travels," she managed, her throat tight. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She breathed in the smell of him, trying to memorize every detail. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "6 weeks," he said. "Maybe less if I can manage it. I'll come back to you, Grace Nolan. That's a promise, and I keep my promises." "I know you do. That's why I believe you." He kissed her one more time, hard and desperate and full of longing, and then he was gone, walking out her door and down her steps to where his horse waited. Grace watched from the window as he mounted up and rode out of town, heading north toward Kansas, carrying her heart with him. The days that followed were strange and difficult. Grace threw herself into her work with even more determination than before, but now it felt different. She wasn't working to outrun her grief anymore. She was working to build something, to prepare for a future that might include Austin. She reorganized the boarding house, making small improvements. She planted a fall garden. She saved every penny she could, thinking ahead to possibilities she barely dared to name. Harold Chen continued to be irritating, making comments about her management and her cooking and anything else he could find to criticize. Thomas Parker finally told him to shut up or find other lodging, which made Grace want to hug the normally mild-mannered merchant. New lodgers came and went, miners and salesmen, and once a family traveling to Fort Smith, but none of them filled the space Austin had left behind. Grace found herself watching the road more than she should, hoping to see a familiar figure on a bay horse. She knew it was too soon, that 6 weeks was her earliest hope, but she couldn't help herself. She lay awake at night and wondered if he was thinking of her, if he was safe, if he was having second thoughts about coming back. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Grace received a letter from James's sister, apologizing for her brother's behavior and saying she'd had no idea about the engagement. Grace wrote back a gracious reply and felt nothing but relief that she'd escaped a marriage to a man so weak. She'd dodged a miserable future, she realized. Austin had helped her see that. 5 weeks after Austin left, a bad storm rolled through Bentonville, bringing high winds and driving rain that lasted for 2 days. Grace worried about travelers caught in the weather, about Austin somewhere on the road in the deluge. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, asking for his safety, for his protection. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and green. 6 weeks came and went. Grace told herself not to panic, that travel was uncertain and delays were common. But doubt crept in with the 7th week, whispering that he'd changed his mind, that he'd decided a settled life wasn't for him after all, that she'd been a fool to hope. She was in her garden pulling weeds, trying not to cry, when she heard hoof beats on the road. She looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and saw a familiar bay horse, a familiar figure in the saddle. Austin had come back. Grace dropped her trowel and stood, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and crossed the distance between them in long strides. She met him halfway, and he caught her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. "You came back," she said against his shoulder. "You actually came back." "Told you I would." He set her down but kept his arms around her, his eyes searching her face hungrily. "Thought about you every mile, every day. Finished what I had to do and turned right around. Got caught in that big storm, lost a week waiting it out. I'm sorry it took so long. You're here now. That's all that matters." He kissed her there in the garden in full view of anyone who might be watching, and Grace didn't care. She kissed him back with all the longing and fear and relief of 7 weeks of waiting, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "I need to tell you something," Austin said, his hands framing her face. "The family I went to see, the ones whose son died, they're good people. They asked me to stay on at their ranch, offered me a permanent position with good pay. I turned them down." Grace's breath caught. "Austin, you shouldn't have done that for me. That was an opportunity." "Let me finish. I turned it down because I told them I was going back to Arkansas to marry a woman who owns a boarding house, and I needed to see if she was still willing to have me. But Grace, I also need to tell you that I've saved money. Not a lot, but enough for a fresh start, and I've been thinking the whole ride back about possibilities." "What kind of possibilities?" "The kind where maybe we take your boarding house business and expand it. Maybe buy some land on the edge of town, build a proper inn with stables. You've got the hospitality skills. I've got the ranch knowledge and the building skills. Together we could create something real, something lasting, something that's ours." Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time they were happy tears. "You've been planning our future." "Our future," he repeated like the words were precious. "If you'll have me, Grace Nolan, I know we've only known each other for a handful of days, but those days changed my life. You changed my life. I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you keep going even when everything hurts. I love the way you make me want to be better, to build something instead of just drifting. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her again, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they finally made it inside, the lodgers stared at them with various expressions of surprise and delight. Thomas Parker started clapping, and soon the others joined in. "About time," Thomas said with a grin. "Thought that Cowboy would never come back." "I always come back to my promises," Austin said, his arm around Grace's waist, "and she's the best promise I ever made." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Bentonville. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and Austin wore a new suit he'd bought with his savings. Thomas Parker stood as witness, and several of the regular lodgers attended. It wasn't the grand wedding Grace had once imagined with James, with all the trappings and social expectations. It was better, because it was real, because it was built on honest love and shared dreams. Their wedding night was spent in Grace's small room, which would now be their room, and Austin made love to her with a tenderness that made her cry. He took his time, learning every inch of her, showing her with his hands and mouth and body how much he cherished her. Grace had been nervous, being with a man for the first time, but Austin was patient and gentle, and by the end she was clinging to him, amazed at the pleasure they could create together. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you," he replied, his fingers tracing patterns on her back. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running. Thank you for giving me a future to dream about again." They lay together in the quiet, and Grace thought about the telegram that had arrived 2 months ago, about how she'd thought her life was over. How wrong she'd been. Her old future had died, yes, but this new one, this unexpected gift, was so much better than anything she could have planned. The next months were busy and full. Austin took over many of the heavy tasks around the boarding house, freeing Grace to focus on the hospitality aspects she did best. He made improvements and repairs, built an addition for storage, negotiated with suppliers. Together, they saved every penny they could, planning for the inn they wanted to build. Harold Chen, still lodging with them, made snide comments about newlyweds and young love not lasting, but everyone else was supportive. Thomas Parker helped Austin find good deals on lumber and supplies. The blacksmith gave them advice on stable construction. The town of Bentonville, it seemed, was rooting for them. In December, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Austin one evening after they'd closed up for the night, after the lodgers had retired and they had privacy. His face lit up with such joy that she started crying, and he held her close, his hand splayed protectively over her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happiest I've ever been. Grace, you've given me everything. A home, a purpose, a family. I don't have words for what that means to me." Their son was born in late summer of 1883, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. They named him Samuel, after Austin's father, and Grace fell in love all over again watching Austin with their child. He was a devoted father, patient and playful, and Sam adored him from the start. By Sam's first birthday, they'd saved enough to buy land on the outskirts of Bentonville. They sold the boarding house to Thomas Parker, who decided to settle permanently in town and wanted a business investment. With the proceeds and their savings, Austin and Grace built their inn, a 2-story building with 8 guest rooms, a large dining room and proper stables. They called it the Fairfield Inn, and it opened in the spring of 1885. The inn was a success from the start. Grace's reputation for excellent food and clean accommodations drew travelers, and Austin's knowledge of horses and his affable nature kept them coming back. They hired help as they grew, first a young woman to assist Grace in the kitchen, then a stable boy for Austin, then more staff as business boomed. Grace got pregnant again in the fall of 1885, and their daughter Rose was born the following summer. She had her father's Summer Creek eyes and her mother's practical nature, and she ruled the household with an iron fist despite being barely able to walk. 2 years later, another son arrived, Benjamin, who was quiet and thoughtful from the beginning. The years passed in a blur of work and love and growing family. The inn thrived, becoming known throughout northwest Arkansas as the finest accommodation between Fort Smith and Springfield. Austin and Grace worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word, building something that was greater than the sum of its parts. On their 10th anniversary, Austin took Grace for a rare evening away from the inn, leaving the staff and their oldest children in charge. They rode out to a hill overlooking Bentonville, the same hill where they'd picnicked several times over the years, and watched the sun set over the town they'd made their home. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Giving up the wandering life?" "Never," Austin said firmly. "Not even once. This life with you and our children, building something lasting, it's better than anything I imagined when I was drifting. Grace, you saved me. You gave me a reason to put down roots, and those roots have grown deeper than I ever thought possible." "You saved me too," she said softly. "I was drowning in grief, convinced my life was over. You showed me that sometimes when one dream dies, it makes room for something better, something real. You still think about him, about what might have been?" Grace considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But only to be grateful it didn't work out. I would have been miserable with James. He wanted someone to fit into his plans, someone to be shaped by his ambitions. You made space for my dreams too. You made our dreams together. That's worth everything." Austin kissed her temple. "I love you more every year. Didn't know that was possible, but it is. I love you too. Even when you track mud through my clean kitchen," he laughed. "That happened once 5 years ago. I have a long memory." They sat together until the stars came out, talking about their children and their plans for the inn, about the future they were still building together. Grace thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, broken and grieving, unable to see past her pain. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that the cowboy who'd knock on her door would change everything, that the future she couldn't imagine would be more wonderful than any dream. But maybe she didn't need to go back. Maybe it was enough to be here now, in this moment, with this man, living the life they'd built together from grief and hope and determined love. 2 more children arrived over the following years, twin girls they named Lily and Faith, born in 1889 when Grace was 30. The inn continued to flourish, and they expanded twice more, adding a new wing and upgrading the stables. Austin trained their sons in ranch work and building, while Grace taught their daughters the hospitality business, though all the children learned both sides of the operation. In 1892, on a warm summer evening much like the one when they'd first met, Grace and Austin sat on the wide front porch of their inn, watching their children play in the yard. Sam was 9 now, tall and serious like his father. Rose was 7, bossing her younger siblings around with good-natured tyranny. Benjamin was 5, shy but fiercely intelligent. The twins were 3 identical whirlwinds of energy and mischief. "We did good," Austin said, his hand finding Grace's. "We did very good," she agreed. Thomas Parker came walking up the path, older and grayer now but still spry. He'd become like family over the years, a beloved uncle to their children and a trusted friend. He joined them on the porch, accepting the glass of lemonade Grace offered. "Wanted to tell you both something," he said. "I'm selling the boarding house, going to retire, maybe travel a bit while I still can." "You'll be missed," Grace said warmly. "That place was my whole world once." "It was a starting point," Thomas said, But you two, you took that start and built an empire. I'm proud of you both." "Hardly an empire," Austin protested, but he was smiling. "The finest inn in Arkansas, 5 healthy children, respect of the whole community. I'd call that an empire." And it all started because a heartbroken woman took a chance on a drifting cowboy, and he was smart enough to take a chance right back. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "It started because I was grieving a future I'd never have, and a cowboy gave me a new one to dream about." "Best decision I ever made," Austin said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Coming back to you." "Best decision I ever made was opening my door that evening," Grace replied. "And every day since, choosing you, choosing this life, has been just as good a decision." Thomas raised his lemonade glass. "To good decisions and better futures." They clinked glasses as the sun set over their inn, over their family, over the life they'd built from loss and love and stubborn hope. Grace looked at her husband, at their children, at the home they'd created, and felt a contentment so deep, it was almost painful. The grief she'd felt that summer day in 1882, standing in her garden with a telegram crumpling in her fist, was a distant memory now. It had been real, that pain, but it had also been necessary. It had cleared the way for this, for Austin, for everything that came after. Sometimes, she thought, the best futures are the ones we never planned, the ones that find us when we're brave enough to let go of what we thought we wanted and reach for what we need instead. "Mama, Daddy, watch this," Rose called, turning a cartwheel in the grass. "Beautiful sweetheart," Grace called back. Austin squeezed her hand. "Our future's pretty great, isn't it?" "The best," Grace said. "The very best." And there on the porch of the inn they'd built together, surrounded by the life they'd created, Grace knew it was true. The future she'd grieved all those years ago had been a pale shadow compared to this reality. This was what love looked like when it was built on honesty and partnership and unwavering commitment. This was what dreams looked like when they were allowed to grow wild and free instead of being forced into someone else's mold. The years continued to unfold with their usual mixture of joy and challenge. In 1895, when Sam was 12, he announced he wanted to learn more about ranching beyond what Austin had taught him. Austin arranged for him to spend summers working at a ranch near Fort Smith. And though Grace worried about her eldest being so far away, she was proud of his ambition and independence. Rose proved to have her mother's head for business, and by age 10, she was helping Grace manage the inn's accounts and supplies. She had a way with guests that put even the most difficult travelers at ease, and Grace knew the inn would be in good hands whenever she was ready to pass it on. Benjamin showed an unexpected talent for music, teaching himself to play the piano in the inn's parlor. Guests would gather in the evenings to hear him play, and more than once someone suggested he should study formally. Austin and Grace discussed it seriously, wanting to support their son's gifts even though it meant he might not follow them into the family business. The twins, Lily and Faith, were inseparable and impossible to tell apart unless you knew them well. Lily was the bolder one, always ready for adventure, while Faith was more cautious and thoughtful. Together they created a kind of joyful chaos that kept the household lively. In 1897, when Grace was 38 and thought her childbearing days were done, she discovered she was pregnant again. Austin was delighted, though Grace felt exhausted just thinking about starting over with an infant. But when their youngest son, James, was born in early 1898, she fell in love all over again with his serious eyes and the way he studied the world around him with intense concentration. 6 children, Austin marveled one night watching Grace nurse the baby. "Never thought I'd have one, let alone 6. Regret coming back to Bentonville yet?" Grace teased. "Never, though I might regret the lack of sleep. Grace laughed softly. "You and me both." As the century turned and 1900 arrived, the Fairfield family stood together on New Year's Eve, watching fireworks that the town had organized to celebrate the new century. Grace, now 41, stood with Austin's arm around her waist, surrounded by their children who ranged from toddler to young adult. The inn behind them was lit up and full of guests celebrating the momentous occasion. "A new century," Austin said wonderingly. "Who knows what it will bring?" "Whatever it brings, we'll face it together," Grace said firmly. Sam, now 17 and tall as his father, raised his glass of cider. "To family and the future." They all echoed the toast, and Grace felt a wave of love so intense it almost overwhelmed her. This was her legacy, these people, this life. Not the boarding house she'd inherited or the inn they'd built, though those were important. Her real legacy was the love she and Austin had created together, the family they'd raised, the example they'd set of partnership and commitment and choosing each other every single day. The next years brought their share of challenges. In 1902, a fire broke out in the kitchen of the inn. Thanks to Austin's quick thinking and the help of neighbors, they managed to contain it before it spread beyond one room, but the damage was significant. For weeks, they operated with a makeshift kitchen while repairs were made, and Grace pushed herself to exhaustion trying to maintain their standards of service. Austin found her crying in their bedroom one night, overwhelmed by the stress and the setback. He held her just as he had that first time 18 years ago, steady and patient until the storm passed. "We'll rebuild," he promised. "We've done it before, we'll do it again. That's what we do, Grace, we build." And they did. The new kitchen was completed by fall, even better than the original, with modern improvements that made the work easier. Grace hired additional help to ease her burden, accepting that she couldn't do everything herself anymore. It was a hard lesson for someone who'd spent so many years being self-sufficient, but Austin helped her see that accepting help was strength, not weakness. In 1904, Sam married a local girl named Catherine, a quiet young woman who'd been helping in the inn's kitchen for 2 years. Grace cried at the wedding, seeing her firstborn so grown up, so ready for his own life. Sam and Catherine built a small house on the inn's property, and Sam took on more responsibilities in managing the stables and grounds. A year later, they made Grace and Austin grandparents with the birth of a daughter they named Grace Catherine. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Grace was transported back to that summer day in 1882, to the woman she'd been, heartbroken and hopeless. If she could go back and tell that woman about this moment, about holding a grandchild named in her honor, about the full, rich life stretching behind her and still ahead, she didn't think that younger self would believe it. "What are you thinking about?" Austin asked, watching her with their granddaughter. "About how far we've come. About how that telegram from James felt like the end of the world and it turned out to be the beginning of everything. Best thing he ever did for you was leave you for someone else," Grace laughed. "That's true. Though I wouldn't phrase it quite so bluntly. I would. He was a fool, and his loss was my gain." Rose married in 1906, choosing a banker's son who was sharp enough to appreciate her business acumen and secure enough in himself not to be threatened by it. She and her husband Joseph opened a general store in town, though Rose still helped manage the inn's accounts and consulted on major decisions. Her wedding was a grand affair, befitting the daughter of the family that ran the finest inn in the region. Benjamin, true to his musical talent, went to study in Little Rock, returning every few months for visits that filled the house with music and stories of city life. He wrote to them faithfully, and his letters were full of gratitude for parents who'd supported his unconventional path. In 1908, he married a schoolteacher named Anna, and they settled in Little Rock where Benjamin taught piano and performed at various venues. The twins, Lily and Faith, were inseparable well into their teenage years. They worked at the inn together, finishing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate without words. In 1909, when they were 20, they both announced engagements to two brothers who'd been staying at the inn while working on the railway. The double wedding was the social event of the season in Bentonville. Young James, named after the man who'd inadvertently set Grace's new life in motion, grew into a thoughtful, studious boy who loved books and learning. He reminded Grace of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge about the world beyond Bentonville. She and Austin made sure he had access to every book they could get him, encouraging his education. In 1910, on their 28th anniversary, Austin took Grace back to that hill overlooking Bentonville. They were both graying now, their bodies showing the wear of years of hard work, but the love between them was as strong as ever. Stronger, perhaps, for being tested and proven through nearly 3 decades of life together. 28 years, Grace said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you knocked on my boarding house door. Best decision I ever made, stopping in Bentonville. Best decision I ever made was letting you help with those dishes, Austin laughed. That's what did it, the dishes. That's when I started to see you, really see you, the kind, competent man who treated me like I mattered, who made me feel capable and worthy instead of broken. You were never broken, Grace, just hurt. There's a difference. I know that now. You taught me that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the town they'd been part of for so long. The inn was visible from their vantage point, expanded now to nearly 3 times its original size. 2 of their children lived on the property with their families, creating a compound of sorts. The Fairfield Inn was a landmark, a destination, a legacy. Do you think we should start thinking about succession? Grace asked. We're not young anymore, Austin. We should make sure the inn goes to whoever will care for it properly. Sam and Catherine are doing most of the day-to-day management already, Austin pointed out. And Rose handles the finances. We've been slowly stepping back for years without really noticing it. That's true. When did we get old enough to step back? Somewhere between baby number 3 and grandchild number 5, I'd guess. Grace laughed. They had 8 grandchildren now, with another on the way. Sam and Catherine had 4 children, Rose and Joseph had 3, and Benjamin and Anna had just had their first. The twins were both expecting their first babies within months of each other. The Fairfield family was growing exponentially, spreading roots deep into Arkansas soil. I'm proud of what we built, Grace said softly. Not just the inn, but all of it. Our family, our life, our love. We took broken pieces and made something whole and beautiful. We did it together, Austin reminded her. That's what makes it work. Neither of us could have done this alone. No, we couldn't have. But together we did the impossible. In 1912, Grace woke one morning feeling unwell. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to age and too much rich food at a recent celebration. But when the feeling persisted, Austin insisted she see a doctor. The diagnosis was pneumonia, and for the first time in their 30 years together, Austin felt real fear grip his heart. Grace was bedridden for weeks, fighting the infection that settled in her lungs. Austin barely left her side, sitting vigil through long nights, holding her hand, praying to a God he'd never been particularly friendly with that he wouldn't take this woman, this love, this life they'd built together. Not yet. They had more years ahead of them. They had grandchildren to watch grow. They had a future still to live. Grace pulled through, her stubborn constitution and Austin's devoted care carrying her past the crisis. but the illness left her weakened, and both of them knew they needed to make changes. They formally handed over management of the inn to Sam and Catherine, with Rose handling all financial matters. Austin and Grace moved into a smaller house on the property, a cottage that Austin built himself, designed for comfort and ease rather than grandeur. The transition was harder than Grace expected. She defined herself by her work for so long that stepping away felt like losing part of her identity. But Austin reminded her that they'd earned this rest, this time to simply be together without the constant demands of business. "We spent 30 years building something for our family," he told her. "Now let's spend whatever years we have left enjoying what we built." So they did. They spent mornings sitting on their cottage porch, watching their grandchildren play. They took short trips to visit Benjamin in Little Rock and to see the other children who'd settled nearby. They read books together in the evenings, Austin reading aloud while Grace knitted or mended. They made love with the comfortable familiarity of long partnership, still finding pleasure and connection in each other's touch. Young James, now 14, came to visit them frequently. He was preparing to leave for university in Fayetteville, and he sought his parents' advice and company. Grace loved these visits, loved seeing the man her youngest son was becoming. "You gave me a great gift, you know," James told her one afternoon as they sat in the cottage garden. "You and Dad both. You showed me what real love looks like, what partnership means." "I won't settle for anything less when I find someone." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. It's true. All my friends' parents, they tolerate each other at best. But you and Dad, you actually like each other. You're friends as well as spouses." "That's rare." "It is rare," Grace agreed. "But it's not magic. It's choice every day. Choosing kindness over cruelty, patience over anger, forgiveness over grudges. Some days it's easy. Some days it's the hardest thing in the world. But we choose it anyway, because the alternative is losing what we have, and that's unthinkable." James nodded thoughtfully. "I hope I find someone worth choosing like that." "You will," Grace assured him. "And when you do, remember that love isn't just a feeling, it's a verb. It's something you do every day in 1,000 small ways." In 1915, Grace and Austin celebrated their 33rd anniversary quietly, just the two of them in their cottage. They were both 60 now, their bodies bearing the marks of age and labor, but their love was undimmed. If anything, it burned brighter for being tested by time and proven true. 33 years, Austin marveled. "Longer than I lived before I met you. Do you remember what you said to me that first night when I was crying over James's telegram?" "I said a lot of things." "You said that the future wasn't dead, just different than I thought it would be." "You were right. This future, this life, it's so much better than anything I imagined back then." "We were lucky," Austin said, "finding each other when we did, both of us broken and ready for something real." "Not luck," Grace corrected gently. "Choice. We chose each other and we kept choosing each other even when it was hard. You're right, and I'd choose you again every time. In every lifetime, in every version of this story, I'd choose you." Grace leaned over and kissed him, this man who'd wandered into her life on a dusty summer evening and given her back hope. "I'd choose you too. Always." They sat together on their porch as the sun set, hands intertwined, hearts still beating in sync after more than 3 decades. Behind them, the inn that bore their name bustled with activity, managed now by their children and full of guests who had no idea of the love story that had built the foundation of the place. Around them, grandchildren played and laughed, carrying forward the legacy of love and commitment and choosing each other that Grace and Austin had established. Grace thought about the woman she'd been at 23, standing in her garden with a crumpling telegram. convinced her life was over. If she could speak to that woman now, she'd tell her that the ending of one dream was just the beginning of another, better one. She'd tell her that the cowboy who was about to knock on her door would change everything, would give her a future beyond anything she could imagine. She'd tell her to be brave, to take the risk, to open her heart even when it felt impossible. But mostly, she'd tell her that the grief was real and valid, but it wouldn't last forever. That pain had a purpose, and sometimes the breaking of one thing was necessary to make room for something better. That the future she couldn't see yet, the one she thought she'd lost, was actually just around the corner, arriving in the form of a tired cowboy with kind eyes and gentle hands. "What are you thinking about?" Austin asked, watching her face in the fading light. "About how grateful I am," Grace said, "for all of it, even the pain, because it led me to you, to this, to everything we built together." "I'm grateful too," Austin said, "for every day with you, for the life you gave me when I thought I was done living. For our children and their children, for this place we created, for 33 years of love and partnership and choosing each other. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Fairfield. And you're the best thing that ever happened to me, Austin Fairfield. My cowboy who gave me a new future to dream about." They sat together until the stars came out, two people who'd found each other in grief and built something beautiful from their brokenness. The future Grace had grieved all those years ago was long forgotten, replaced by a reality so much richer and more wonderful than any fantasy. This was what real love looked like, not perfect or easy, but chosen every day, with intention and commitment and stubborn hope. And as the night settled around them, Grace knew with absolute certainty that if she had to live her life over, she wouldn't change a single thing. Every moment of pain, every tear shed, every lonely night in that boarding house had been necessary to bring her to this, to Austin, to their family, to this perfect, imperfect, beautiful life they'd created together. The grief had been real, but so was the joy that came after. And the joy, she'd learned, always lasted longer than the pain.